We begin this story with Greg, who, despite having a depressing job, is consumed by images of a huge house and a beautiful woman inside it. The feeling of having been in that house is too real to ignore. Something inside him tells him that this is his home, even if he is not currently sure whether it truly exists. While Greg gets lost in his drawings, he is interrupted by a call from his daughter, Emily, inviting him to her graduation ceremony. Although Greg wants to be there for his daughter, his marriage ended badly, and the last thing he wants is for his ex-wife to cause a scene and ruin Emily's special day. In addition to his failed marriage, Greg needs expensive medication for his knee problem, which causes him severe pain when he exerts himself too much. To top off his bad streak, he has spent so much time daydreaming and drawing that his work performance is a disaster, and he's been fired from his job. When Greg receives the news of his dismissal, he doesn't react at all, which worries his boss about his mental health. But suddenly Greg stands up so abruptly that his boss is startled and falls, hitting his head on the desk. Instead of asking for help, Greg's mind races at 1,000 kilometers per hour, and he does exactly the opposite of what he should do in this situation. He lifts his boss and places him against the window, hiding him behind the curtains until he regains consciousness. Miraculously, Greg's scheme works, and he manages to leave the office before anyone realizes what happened, although he's obviously still fired. As is typical for a man going through a rough patch, Greg goes to the first bar he can find, intending to drown his sorrows in alcohol. There he meets Isabelle, a beautiful but somewhat unhinged woman who keeps telling Greg that he is real and that he has powers. Powers that turn out to be real, since Isabelle manages to knock down a waiter's tray with her mind. Although it simply looks like an accident, Isabelle says she saw what he did to his boss and can help him solve all his problems. As if the proposal of a gorgeous, homeless-looking woman with powers weren't enough to make you think you're going insane, Greg agrees to join her in her escapades. After placing a small, shiny rock in Greg's drink and waiting for him to drink it, she asks him to concentrate on his boss and use his mental strength to push him backward. Greg doesn't quite understand and ends up pushing him forward, causing his boss to fall from the top floor onto the street. Even though that wasn't the plan, it becomes the perfect alibi for Greg. His boss took his own life right at the moment his colleagues saw Greg leaving the bar. Later, Isabelle takes Greg to her place beneath a bridge, while Greg can't stop thinking that this is all a bad trip. That night, Greg stays with Isabelle as they see on the news that his boss's case was closed as self-inflicted death, so he can return to his sad former life. But that life is getting worse by the day. No wife, no family, and living in a depressing hotel that frequently loses electricity. Meanwhile, Isabelle shows surprising vitality despite her material poverty, not to mention she has powers and promises to teach Greg how to use his. Elsewhere, Emily talks to her brother Arthur about ways to bring their father back into their lives. They don't need him to get back with their mother, they only want him close by. Arthur tells Emily that it's better to leave things as they are. Although he knows Greg is a good father, he has lost all faith in him and refuses to be part of his sister's plan. Meanwhile, Greg continues spending time with Isabelle, consuming the little crystals that supposedly allow them to maintain their powers. Together, they sink into complete passion as they use their powers to have fun at the expense of people Greg no longer respects because he's convinced they aren't real. Right after causing chaos in a bowling alley, they escape and watch the police arrest 2 people. Suddenly, Greg sees himself inside the patrol car. Then, in an even more confusing turn, Greg and Isabelle appear in the patrol car and are taken to jail, spending the night locked up. The next morning, they are released, and although Greg now looks as homeless as Isabelle, he appears happy and excited about his life. Emily, however, has not been able to contact her father and begins looking for him, starting with his hotel, but Greg hasn't been there for weeks. Yet while Arthur is having lunch with his friends, Greg walks into the restaurant, and Arthur sees what his father has become. Still, he isn't able to approach him. Back with our protagonist, the world looks very bleak when they don't have the crystals. Isabelle has had to sell her body on the street to get the money they need. Then she goes to Kendo to get more crystals. And though the place is terribly depressing, the way they manufacture the crystals is novel, through a laboratory with a lot of equipment. While Greg waits in the street, Emily arrives by taxi. Arthur has told her where he saw their father, and she has come to find out what's going on and why he suddenly disappeared. Greg keeps apologizing to his daughter and promises to attend her graduation ceremony. But Emily tells him that the ceremony was 15 days ago. That's how long Greg has been missing. The man refuses to go with his daughter, so she leaves him her graduation photo and phone number in case he needs something. When Isabelle returns, Greg is anxious to regain his powers and eats all the crystals at once, just in time to use them against some men who were following them. Slowly, months pass, and Greg continues living with Isabelle, consuming crystals and using his powers for fun. One morning when Greg comes back, Isabelle is furious because he didn't tell her where he was going. When she finds Emily's photo in his pocket, she gets even angrier, yelling that Emily isn't real and he must forget her. However, Greg is no longer certain what's real and what isn't. Besides, this life no longer satisfies him. It has nothing to do with the drawings he once made so passionately. Because of this, Isabelle decides to show him the real world and takes out some blue crystals, which are the mechanism to exit this simulation. But there aren't enough for both of them. They need to inhale 10 each, and she only has 16. So they must take the risk of inhaling just 8, hoping that's enough to exit safely. The instant Greg inhales the crystals, he wakes up in a room with a tube connected to his face, which is hooked to a huge machine seemingly filled with brains floating in gelatin. Nearby, Isabelle wakes up as well, appearing to be a renowned doctor in charge of this research. Greg is called Doctor, too, although he seems to be suffering some memory loss due to the time he spent inside the simulation. After learning that his daughter and family are only NPCs in the simulation, Greg feels a bit sad while Isabelle promises to explain everything over lunch. The world Isabelle calls real seems overwhelming. The technology is beyond anything Greg can currently understand, and holograms are common for everyone. Isabelle takes Greg for a stroll, where all of his drawings come to life, and his house is exactly as he dreamed, only much better now that he can experience it. That night, it's time to present Isabelle's project to the world. They ask Greg the same questions they asked before he entered the simulation, and he sincerely expresses how grateful he is for the perfect world he now inhabits. The presentation is a total success, and during the party, Greg sees Emily from afar and follows her away from the others. As Greg approaches his daughter, the world around him starts to look darker. The lamps and beautiful decorations disappear, leaving behind graffiti and trash everywhere. The protagonist keeps talking to her about the real world and how perfect it is. He also asks whether she exists in this world so they can meet. Emily tries to convince her father that what he's seeing isn't part of her world. She found the crystals and knows they're psychotropic drugs that have affected his mind so severely that Greg can't distinguish reality from illusion. With each childhood memory Emily shares, Greg's perfect world becomes even grayer. Nevertheless, Greg believes Isabelle's words and remains convinced this world is real, prompting Emily to tell him she loves him and hopes he'll make the right decision and return to reality. Suddenly, the perfect world begins to collapse, and Greg is forced to take one of the yellow crystals to save Isabelle from being crushed by a crowd. While they fight, Isabelle tells him she doesn't understand why he's using his powers. They are in the real world, but it looks less and less clear as they move on. Suddenly, the once gorgeous corridors transform into alleyways, and the civilized people turn into protesters. Fire and chaos spread through the streets. Isabelle believes it's a glitch caused by taking fewer crystals than necessary. They race to the lab to return to the simulation and find more crystals. Suddenly, they're back searching for Kendo, but everything changes when Greg sees his boss alive on the other side of the street. The protagonist runs after him, asking why he's still alive. This triggers great doubt in Greg's mind, and Isabelle promises to explain once they find Kendo. After stealing a car, they drive to Kendo's neighborhood where they finally find him. But just when he refuses to give them any crystals, Isabelle kills him with a gun. The police arrive, and they escape over the rooftop while Greg keeps repeating that he's in a simulation and will soon return to the real world. They must get to Isabelle's place, where the device for inhaling the crystals is kept. Once they manage to get there, Isabelle discovers there were only 10 crystals in the bag. The police surround them as they decide who will get to take the 10 crystals. They can't risk taking fewer. Once again, Isabelle seems to crumble under the situation, so Greg makes a difficult decision. He hands her the crystal so she can escape. Suddenly, Emily's voice is heard in the distance, and Greg knows he still has his daughter. It doesn't matter whether she's real or not. It's more than Isabelle has in this world, and for him, that is enough. After one final kiss, Isabelle walks out toward the officers, buying enough time for Greg to flee down the back alleys. From a distance, Greg sees Isabelle inhale the crystals and collapse. Then he runs away as fast as he can. Once he's far enough, he starts crying over the wreck his life has become. He isn't sure if he's in the real world or in a simulation. The only thing he knows is that he still has Emily. The first thing he does in his quest to regain his daughter's love is run to the nearest rehabilitation center, where he plans to get his life back in order. There, they welcome him with open arms, and Greg can begin the long rehabilitation process that will let him be part of his family again. Or maybe it's all just a simulation. What do you think?
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.